Amanda from Pontes Books here with the Chapter 19 Historical Tidbit for The Prince and the Pauper. Today's historical tidbit is one that is explicitly referenced in the chapter, but only gets a brief mention and not a lot of context, but does tell a story that ends up being pretty, I don't know if historically accurate is the correct term, but correct to what the legend says, I guess you could say. So our historical tidbit that we are looking at today is King Alfred, as seen in the picture that's right there. So the place where we see this reference in The Prince and the Pauper is kind of in the middle of the chapter, where Edward is being asked to watch the food while the housewife, I guess you could say, who is kind of taken him in, is trying to figure out where he comes from, what his job is. So she's asking him all these questions, trying to figure out all these things. So at some point she comes to the conclusion that he was a cook, and then at some point narrows it down to being like, oh, he's a cook in like the palace, because he knows about all these royal foods, and he's always like gets really excited when we talk about like kings and queens and, you know, royals and things like that. So she decides to test him out by having him watch the food. And she's like, oh, go ahead and, you know, improvise a little bit, you know, go crazy. And so he, at first in his head, is like, wait, what? This peasant woman wants me to cook? But then he remembers something. So that's where this quote comes in. Another English king had a commission like to this. In a bygone time, it is nothing against my dignity to undertake an office which the great Alfred stooped to assume, but I will try to better serve my trust than he, for he let the cakes burn. So this is the Alfred that we are referencing. I think it comes up one more time in the chapter to when he actually does wreck the food. I think he references it again, maybe. But today we're looking at who is that Alfred. So who was King Alfred? Alfred was also known as Alfred the Great, and he was the king of Wessex, which is an area, I believe, in southwesterly England. So it's a region in England. And he was born in 849 AD. So this was quite a bit of time before Edward was actually alive. And he was king from 871 to 899 when he died. And he is best known for defending Wessex, if that's how you pronounce that area, defending them against a Danish Viking invasion. So the Danes came to invade really places all around England, but he was actually able to kind of defend his area a little bit better than some of the other areas. But that's kind of like a long story is going into that whole invasion. So we're not entirely going into that. We're going to more into this story of like burning the cakes. So the story of King Alfred and the cakes. So first and foremost, it's important to note that I'll get into this a little bit later, but the cakes are not like what most people, at least in the US, think of cake right now, which is like a pastry, like a sweet treat with like frosting on it. It's more like a small loaf of bread. So just like a little bread circle. So the way the story goes is that during this Viking invasion, he was actually on the run. So he was hiding from the Danes, hiding from the Vikings, and he hid in a peasant woman's house. So I believe it was like a herdsman or a swineherd, and this was his wife then, that he was kind of with her in their house. And she actually didn't recognize him as the king. So she has to go and like grab something, more firewood or something. She asks him to watch her cakes that are baking by the embers of the fire. And then while he's supposed to be watching them, according to some stories, he gets distracted. According to other stories, he falls asleep and he actually lets them burn. And the woman comes back and scolds him because, again, she doesn't know that he is the king. So this is actually a very similar story to what's happening in Edward's case here. So he's referencing something but that's actually, it seems like Mark Twain is like almost pulling from this story directly for what he has happening in this scene here. Edward's supposed to watch the food. He lets it burn because he's so distracted thinking about himself and his problems, which is similar to what supposedly happened to King Alfred and his cakes. So looking at this story, the question is then, is the story true? So looking at this, it is likely that this story is made up. So there's not really any hard and fast evidence that it really did happen. The earliest example of the story actually wasn't written until about 300 years after the actual event would have happened. So some people look at this and they say, well, maybe if this is like a myth or a legend, like something meant to tell a lesson, what is the moral? Like what's supposed to be the takeaway from, obviously, don't get distracted or the cakes will burn? I don't know. There's not a clear like moral message. So a lot of times when stories are more like legend fiction, there's like a strong lesson that can be taken away from it. And this story doesn't actually really have that. So, and then other people say they weren't actually cakes or like those small things of bread. They were actually loaves of bread, which I see as a technicality, but apparently some people think that that's a, no in the story. And then also just the fact that because these stories were passed down by word of mouth for so many years, there's a good chance that things have been exaggerated or added to make it more exciting. So then lastly, I just wanted to look into like how do you make these, well, I guess this doesn't really show how you make, but kind of the process that Edward, well, he wasn't watching cakes, but Alfred in this case was going through of watching these cakes, like just a little bit more about what those cakes are. So you can, if you're watching the video, you can see them pictured there. They're just little round discs of bread. And at the time, most homes didn't have their own ovens, so most of them just relied on bakeries to make their bread. But houses that were really far out in the country didn't have that luxury to be able to get bread, frequently from the bakery. So they would actually bake the cakes on their own fire. And so cast iron equipment was very expensive. So they would actually just set it right on the embers of their fire. And you had to be really careful because there was this delicate balance of them being undercooked or them being burnt. And you were looking for this perfect consistency of like the outside being scorched, but the inside being fluffy and warm. So obviously Alfred missed that window. So that's King Alfred. Hopefully you learned something. Have a good rest of your day.